I kept the kettle on long after the water had boiled because it gave my hands something to do. The kitchen clock in my little house on Maple Street ticked louder than it used to, or maybe I was just listening harder. On the table sat a yellow legal pad with my own crooked handwriting at the top, called Renee, under it 3 days of blank space. Next to the pad was the discharge packet from St. Luke's, still folded the way the nurse had pressed it into my palm, as if paper could keep a man upright. A month earlier, I would have told you silence could keep a home steady. If you didn't name the scary thing, it stayed smaller, like a stain you covered with a rug. That was always my trick. Clean up, carry on, don't make it a subject. I could hear my mother's voice in my head, brisk as a broom. Don't stir it up, Frank. Let it lie. So I let things lie for decades, and I got good at it. Now, with bruised ribs that complained every time I drew a full breath, I understood something different. Silence doesn't shrink anything. It just moves the weight around until it lands somewhere you can't ignore. The hospital papers said fall risk in bold letters, and I hated that phrase like it was an accusation. I'd fallen in my own driveway, yes. But I was still the same man who had driven an 18-wheeler through ice storms and brought home paychecks that smelled like diesel and metal. A man like that doesn't call his daughter to confess he's scared. The phone sat beside the sugar bowl. Renee had called twice the day after I got home, and both times I let it ring out. Not because I didn't love my daughter, because I could already hear the careful tone she uses when she's trying not to sound like she's parenting me. I didn't want to argue, didn't want to disappoint her, didn't want to admit that my knees had started to wobble when I stood too fast. I told myself I was protecting our peace, when really I was protecting my pride. I stared at the legal pad until the ink looked watery. Finally, I lifted the receiver and dialed, then hung up before the first ring finished. My own hesitation surprised me. I set the receiver down gently as if it were fragile, and I felt a familiar old shame settle in my chest. That afternoon, I drove to the cemetery instead because graves don't ask questions. The sky was low and the ground was stiff with February cold. I parked near Marion's stone, brushed off winter leaves, and told her out loud that I was fine. The wind moved through bare branches and gave me no answer. Standing there, I remembered another day I'd avoided words. Years ago, in a different hospital, with my father staring at me like he was waiting for something I couldn't give. The memory rose so sharp it made my throat burn, and before I could stop myself, I was back there again. It was 1987 when I first learned how much a conversation can cost you if you keep postponing it. My father was in Mercy Hospital on the south side that smelled like bleach and old coffee. I remember the plastic chair beside his bed and the way the television in the corner kept talking even when neither of us looked at it. He was 62 but looked older, his skin loose around his jaw, his hands trembling when he tried to lift the paper cup of water. I had driven down after my shift, still in my work boots, and I stood in the doorway a second too long, trying to decide what kind of son to be. The nurse had pulled me aside in the hall and said in a voice meant to be gentle that Dad's liver was failing. She asked if we had talked about plans, about who would make decisions if he couldn't. I nodded like a man who had everything arranged, then walked into the room and made a joke about hospital food. Back then, I believed respect meant leaving people alone. My father was stubborn and proud, and I'd grown up learning that you didn't challenge a proud man. You let him keep his story. So I sat down and asked about the Cubs and the weather, anything that didn't touch the real thing, He watched me with those tired eyes and said, "Frankie, you still driving the long routes?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Good, keep busy." That was his version of love, and I took it as permission to stay shallow. What I understand now is that I wasn't respecting him. I was protecting myself from feeling helpless. Every time the conversation leaned toward his drinking, toward the way his hands shook, toward the bills piled at home, I steered us back to safe water. I told myself we had time. I told myself he would get stronger. I told myself I would talk to him when he got out. One evening near the end, he asked me to open the drawer in the bedside table. Inside was a folded envelope, soft at the corners from being handled. "Your mother wrote that," he said, "after she left." He didn't look at me when he spoke, just stared at the wall like he was watching a movie only he could see. My throat tightened. I could have asked what it said, could have asked what he needed, could have asked the question that had lived between us for years. "Why couldn't you stop?" Instead, I said, "You want me to put it somewhere safe?" He nodded, and I tucked it into my jacket pocket, my heart hammering as if I'd done something brave. He died 2 days later before we ever talked about the envelope, before we ever talked about anything that mattered. Driving home in the dark, I kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other on that paper in my pocket, and I promised myself I would be different with my own family. I promised I would speak sooner. A few years later, with a mortgage and a baby in the house, I discovered how easy it is to break a promise you made in grief. In the years after Dad's funeral, I worked like a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. Marion and I bought our first house in 1992, a narrow brick place with a creaky porch step and a maple tree that dropped helicopters onto the sidewalk every spring. Renee was 4 then, all elbows and questions. I loved them both so much it made me nervous, like love was something you could lose if you looked at it too hard. One Tuesday in late October, I came home with a layoff notice folded in my wallet. The trucking company had lost a contract, and the supervisor had said, "Nothing personal," the way people do when it is personal. I sat in my pickup in the driveway and watched the kitchen light through the window. I could see Marion moving at the sink, her shoulders lifting and dropping as she washed dishes. I should have walked in and told her right away. I should have said, "I'm scared, and I don't know what we're going to do." Instead, I waited until I could pull on a face that looked like certainty. Back then, I believed providing was the same thing as loving. If I handled the money and kept the fridge full, the rest would take care of itself. Words felt like a luxury. I'd grown up in a house where problems were absorbed, not discussed, and I carried that habit like a tool belt. So when Marion asked, "How was work?" I kissed her cheek and said, "Fine." I said it so easily it almost sounded true. What I understand now is that my silence didn't protect her. It made her lonely in her own kitchen. The next week I was short with Renee over spilled cereal, and Marion watched me like she was trying to read a sign I wouldn't hang up. After Renee went to bed, Marion sat across from me at the table with a stack of bills and said, "Frank, something's off. Talk to me." I stared at the wood grain like it could answer for me. I told her not to worry. I told her I had it handled. I didn't tell her I'd been waking at 3 a.m. with my stomach tight as a fist. Eventually, I found another route, and the crisis passed, the way small fires do when you smother them with work. But the habit stayed. Each time Marion reached for the truth, I handed her a smoother version. I told myself I was sparing her, but the truth is, I couldn't stand looking like I needed help. A decade later, when Marion started losing weight without trying, she joked about finally fitting into her old jeans. We laughed in the hallway of our family doctor's office while the nurse checked her blood pressure. I still believed we could joke our way around anything. When the doctor returned with his serious face and said he wanted a few more tests, Marion's smile faltered. She looked at me as if waiting for me to name what we were both thinking. I patted her hand and said, "It's probably nothing." Even as I said it, I felt the old lie settle into place, and I watched it build the distance between us again. The tests turned into appointments that filled our calendar like weeds. By early 2003, we were sitting in an oncology office with walls the color of oatmeal and a fish tank that hummed in the corner. Marion wore a knit cap even though it wasn't cold, more for comfort than vanity. I remember the paper crinkle under her when she shifted on the exam table and the way my own hands kept opening and closing on my knees as if I could squeeze a better outcome out of them. When the doctor explained the treatment plan, he used words like aggressive and response and manage, all of them meant to sound hopeful. Marion listened carefully, nodding at the right places. I listened too, but I was also listening for the moment when someone would say plainly that we could lose. No one did. When the nurse came in afterward with a clipboard and asked who should be contacted in an emergency, I answered without looking at Marion. When she asked about advance directives, I said, "We'll take care of that later." The nurse's pen paused. Marion's eyes slid to mine. Back then, I believed staying upbeat was the same thing as staying strong. I thought if I refused to speak the dark possibility, I was keeping it from entering the room. So I filled the days with errands and meals and jokes about hospital parking. At night, I sat in the recliner beside Marion's bed and watched late-night television with the volume low, as if quiet could help her heal. What I understand now is that my cheerfulness was another kind of wall. Marion needed me to be with her, not ahead of her, not pretending we were somewhere safer. One afternoon, after a chemo session, we stopped at a grocery store on the way home because Marion craved peaches. In the produce aisle, she leaned on the cart, suddenly tired, and said very softly, "Frank, if this goes bad, what do you want for Renee?" She didn't sound dramatic. She sounded practical, like she was asking about insurance. My stomach clenched. I saw Dad's hospital room, that envelope in my pocket, all the things I had not said. I pushed the cart forward too fast, as if motion could drown her words. "Let's not talk like that," I said. "You're going to be fine." Marion looked at the peaches, not at me, and she nodded once. She didn't argue. That was what I took as relief at the time. The months that followed were a blur of medications and schedules. Renee was in middle school then, old enough to sense fear, but young enough to think it was her fault. I told her, "Mom's just tired," while Marion slept with her face turned to the wall. I kept telling myself the right conversation would happen when we had more certainty. Then one rainy evening, Marion called me into the bedroom and asked me to sit on the edge of the bed. Her voice was steady, but her hands shook when she reached for mine. "We need to talk," she said. The words hung in the air like a door I had tried to keep closed, and I realized I had run out of later. Segment 5. Words 550. Characters 2,908. Marion's "we need to talk" was not a cry. It was a request, the same way she would ask me to tighten a loose hinge or check the oil. The lamp on her nightstand cast a circle on the quilt while rain tapped the window. I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to look like a man who wasn't bracing. She said she wanted to put things in order. She wanted the will updated, the house paperwork gathered, passwords written down. She wanted to choose a song for the service just in case. That phrase made my stomach turn. Back then, I believed if I let her plan for death, I was helping death practice. So I nodded at the practical parts and flinched at the rest. When she mentioned a DNR form the hospital had given her, I heard myself say, "We don't need to decide that now." My voice came out firm, almost an order. What I understand now is that she wasn't inviting death in. She was trying to give us a handrail. Marion had always been a step ahead of chaos. That's how she kept our family warm. In that moment, she was offering me the same steadiness, and I pushed it away because I was afraid. She didn't fight me. Marion never wasted energy arguing with a wall. She reached into the drawer and pulled out a small notebook. In it, she had written phone numbers, account names, and the location of the deed. She had a neat list titled "For Renee." At the bottom, she had written, "Tell her I'm proud." I stared at that line, and Marion watched me with a tired patience that made me feel young and foolish. "Promise me you'll talk to her if I can't," she said. I promised. I meant it. I was still the kind of man who thought a promise could bend time. Marion lasted another 11 months. Some days Renee painted her toenails and tried to make her laugh. Other days I carried her from the bathroom to the bed and pretended my arms weren't shaking. Near the end, a hospice nurse asked me, right in our kitchen, about forms and decisions. I signed what needed signing with a hand that felt borrowed. I still avoided certain words, like a child skipping the scary page in a book. When Marion died, the house went quiet in a way I'd never heard before. Renee was 21 then, home from college, standing in the doorway of the bedroom with her arms wrapped around herself. She asked what we were supposed to do next. I heard Marion's request, talk to her, and I opened my mouth, and nothing came out except, "We'll figure it out." In the months after the funeral, Renee called. Sometimes she just wanted to sit with me and look through photo albums. Sometimes she asked questions about money, whether I was eating, what I wanted to do with the house. Each time I gave her an answer and changed the subject. I believed then that if I stayed strong and silent, she wouldn't have to carry two griefs. What I understand now is that my silence handed her a third, not knowing where she stood with her own father. Segment 6. Words, 547. Characters, 2,858. For a long time, I told myself I was managing just fine. I kept the lawn cut, kept Marion's recipes in rotation, kept the porch light working. I still drove to the hardware store on Saturdays, even if I had to rest my hand on the cart handle like it was a cane. When Renee suggested I move closer to her, I laughed and said, "I'm not moving into some retirement village." I said it like it was a joke, but I meant it. What I believed then was that independence was the last proof I had left. After Marion, after Dad, after the years rolling by, I needed one thing I could point to and say, "This is mine. I'm still standing." I didn't see how much work Renee was doing just to read the weather in my voice. Then came the fall, ordinary as a grocery run. It was a bright afternoon in November 2025. I had backed the pickup out and realized I'd left my phone on the workbench in the garage. I stepped out, turned too quickly, and my right foot caught the edge of the driveway where the concrete had chipped. I remember the strange, slow feeling of my body deciding before I did. My hands reached for air. My shoulder hit first, then my ribs, then the back of my head on the cold concrete. For a second, I saw nothing but sky, and it looked far away. A neighbor I barely knew, Mrs. Caldwell, found me and called 911. She also called Renee because her number was taped inside my wallet, something Marion had insisted on years ago. In the emergency room, under fluorescent lights that made everyone look tired, Renee stood at the foot of my bed with her coat still on. She tried to smile, but I could see she was shaking. I cracked a joke about trying out for a stunt show. She didn't laugh. The discharge planner came in with a clipboard. The same kind of woman, the same kind of questions I'd dodged with my father and with Marion. "Do you live alone?" she asked. I said yes. "Do you have someone who can check on you?" Renee answered before I did. The planner talked about grab bars, home health, follow-up appointments, and she looked at me the way nurses do when they're gauging whether a man is being realistic. Back then, I believed if I agreed to small fixes, no bigger conversation would be necessary. So I nodded at the grab bars, promised I'd use a cane, told Renee I'd take it easy. What I understand now is that I was bargaining with time. I was trying to buy my way out of admitting that my life had changed. Renee drove me home in her car. My truck left in the hospital lot until a friend could fetch it. On the ride, she kept both hands on the steering wheel and said, carefully, "Dad, we need to talk about some things." I looked out at the passing storefronts and told her we could talk later after I'd rested. She didn't push. She just nodded, but I saw her jaw tighten, and I knew the conversation had already begun, whether I answered or not. Renee came back the following Saturday. I heard her tires on the gravel before I saw her, and I felt that old instinct to tidy up the truth. I shoved the pill bottles into the cabinet, folded the throw blanket, and wiped the counter even though it was already clean. When I opened the door, she hugged me carefully, mindful of my ribs, and she felt like the kid I used to know. She carried a folder under her arm. She set it on the coffee table like something fragile and said, "I'm not here to fight with you." I tried to lighten it. "If this is an intervention, at least bring donuts." She gave me a small smile, then sat down. Back then, I believed the worst thing a father could do was become a burden. I believed if Renee saw the full picture, how the stairs made my knee ache, and I sometimes waited for dizziness to pass, she would start looking at me like a problem to solve. I thought this conversation would be the moment she stopped seeing me as her dad. What I understand now is that she had been carrying the worry for years without letting it spill onto me. The folder wasn't a threat. It was her way of putting shape around something we kept pretending had no shape. She opened it and slid out a list: doctor contacts, medication names, emergency numbers, and a page titled Preferences. At the bottom, she had written in her neat print, "Dad's wishes." She said, "Ugh, I don't want to guess in a crisis. I don't want to make choices and wonder later if I did it wrong." I tried to wave it off. "You're getting ahead of yourself," I said. "I'm not going anywhere." Renee didn't raise her voice. She just looked at me and said, "Dad, you fell. You hit your head. You didn't call me because you didn't have your phone. If Mrs. Caldwell hadn't walked by, I don't know how long you would have been there." Then, quieter. "I can't keep pretending this is nothing." The room went still except for the refrigerator hum. I felt the old urge to change the subject, to joke my way back to safe water. Instead, I took a slow breath and said, "I'm scared." The words came out plain, and once they were in the room, they didn't destroy us. Renee's eyes filled, and she reached across the table and put her hand over mine. We talked for a long while. I told her about my father in Mercy Hospital and the envelope I never opened. I told her about Marion's notebook and the line she'd written for Renee. I admitted how many times I'd promised myself I would speak sooner and how often I hadn't. Renee listened without interrupting. When I finally ran out of words, she said, "Thank you," like I had finally arrived. As daylight thinned at the windows, she asked if we could look at options together. Maybe a smaller place, maybe closer to her, maybe just a plan. I looked around the living room at Marion's photo on the shelf and the worn spot on the chair, and I understood the conversation had already changed something. "Okay," I said, "let's do it." The next morning, my living room looked the same, but I didn't. I woke up with the conversation still in my mouth, like a taste I wasn't used to. The air felt lighter and also more serious. After breakfast, I opened Marion's old recipe box and found, tucked behind the index cards, the little notebook she'd kept. I ran my thumb along the worn edge. Back then, I thought looking at it would hurt too much. What I understand now is that avoiding pain doesn't keep you safe, it just keeps you unprepared. Renee and I started small. On a Tuesday afternoon, we sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd stared at a blank legal pad, and we filled out forms. Not as a dramatic event, just a steady one. I wrote down what I wanted if I couldn't speak for myself. I chose Renee as the person to decide, and saying it out loud made me both relieved and ashamed because she had already been that person in her mind for years. She didn't scold me, she just asked questions and waited for honest answers. The following week, we toured a one-story townhome 10 minutes from her house. The place smelled like new paint and carpet glue. The leasing woman talked about maintenance and snow removal, and Renee nodded, listening like she had done 100 times for her own life. I walked slowly through the rooms and noticed the little things. No stairs, wide doorways, light switches at a comfortable height. Back then, I would have called those features humiliating. What I understand now is that they are simply part of the season I'm in. I didn't decide immediately. I went back to Maple Street and sat in my old chair and watched the afternoon sun crawl across the floor. I thought about Marion's photo on the shelf and the sound of Renee's voice when she said she didn't want to guess. I also thought about my father's envelope still in a drawer at my house, unopened. That night, I finally took it out. The paper crackled like dry leaves. Inside was a short letter from my mother. Plain, unsentimental, full of regret and a little kindness. She wrote that she had loved him once and that she hoped he would forgive her. Reading it, I realized forgiveness is a kind of conversation too, and I had delayed mine for nearly 40 years. On Friday, I drove to the cemetery again. I stood by Marion's stone and told her what I had done, what I was doing, and what I was finally willing to say. I didn't tell her I was fine. I told her I missed her. I told her I was afraid sometimes. I told her Renee and I had talked for real and that our words had held. A month later, I signed the lease on the townhome and began packing boxes. Some evenings, Renee came over and wrapped dishes in newspaper while we told stories I hadn't told her before. The house on Maple Street didn't feel like it was being taken from me. It felt like it was being carried forward, one honest conversation at a time, into whatever comes next.